Good afternoon. I'm Kristen Spindler, Director of IncubatorCTX and a faculty member at Concordia University, Texas. I'd like to welcome all of you to our IncubatorCTX speaker series. Today's speaker is Dr. Roverto Newell Garcia, economist, non-governmental organization expert, and a board member to premier companies. Among Dr. Newell's many experiences during his career, I'm going to name just a few. First of all, he was a senior partner at McKinsey & Company. He received his PhD in economics from the University of Texas at Austin. He's a board member of Walmart de Mexico. He is a public policy scholar at the Mexican Institute of the Woodrow Wilson School in Washington, D.C. He's also Chief Academic Officer at University of the Americas in Mexico. And finally, he's a senior fellow and founding director of IMCO, which is a privately sponsored independent think tank located in Mexico City. His talk today centers on lessons learned in his career working with NGOs. We're so honored to have him speak with us today. The format today for our webinar will be about 35 to 40 minutes as Dr. Newell Garcia takes us through his presentation, and then we'll leave the last 20 minutes or so for question and answer. So if you have a question for us, please type your question in the chat and address your question to all panelists and participants. Julia and I are going to be monitoring the chat. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Shane Sokol, Chief Strategy Officer at Concordia University, Texas. He's going to tell you a little bit more about Dr. Newell Garcia. Thanks, Shane.
Thank you, Kristen. What a pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. And so happy to have our good friend, Dr. Roverto Newell Garcia, with us. He's a friend of the university. He's a friend of President Christian, Provost Kirk. We had the great privilege of having him join us at the leadership team end of year strategy event, which we call Tie the Bow, where we think about the past. In fact, in this past August, we were actually thinking about how we executed the last strategic plan, and we were just moving into the new strategic plan, which is Build, Connect, Thrive. And having Dr. Roverto be with us and share jewels of insight about what we should be considering as we go into the future as part of an industry that is very turbulent. Lots of change going on in the midst of a pandemic, which accelerated a lot of the change. And we came away from that time really enriched and gleaned much insight from Dr. Roverto's many years of experience, really navigating lots of change and turbulence. And so I want to say thank you again, Dr. Newell Garcia, for joining us and for that special time we had in the summer. So we look forward to hearing what you're going to share with us today. And I've got my notepad ready to go. I'll pass it over to you. Thank you.
Okay, well, let me start off by saying that both Kristen and Shane stressed the many experiences over the many years. So I will admit that my real name is Methuselah, and I've been around forever. I'm working on my 973rd year of existence. No, I am old. It's clear. I'm 74. For those of you who are curious, the juxtaposition, Newell Garcia should communicate something important. My dad was American, which is how I come by my English and my looks. My mom was Mexican. They met shortly after the Second World War and were married literally 3 weeks after the meeting. I grew up in Mexico. I consider myself a Mexican. And so the juxtaposition, while rich, doesn't belie an identity. I am mostly Mexican, though I feel very comfortable and very fond of the United States. Let me tell you what I'm going to talk about. And I was taught at McKinsey that I'm supposed to tell you what I'm going to talk about, then talk about it, and then at the end tell you what I talked about. And so I will try and do that. I think NGOs are harder to manage than the average business. The reason is that they are trying to serve two sometimes conflicting purposes. One is to do good, and there are many ways in which NGOs try to carry out their mission, which tends to be doing good in many dimensions, health, education, religion, and in some cases, public policy, which is a different type of entity. They also, though, have to face the challenge of survival. And as a consequence, they have to run themselves with enough efficiency and with enough concern for a bottom line that they can ensure their survival over a long period of time. And consequently, being a good steward of an NGO requires actually balancing that social purpose that the NGO exists to serve with the imperative to survive and go through complex and turbulent times that sometimes are so dislocating that they can actually threaten both the purpose of the institution and its economic survival. I'm going to do so really in three very small chunks. I'm going to start off with a brief set of facts about NGOs in the United States. I'm going to be talking about the United States to frame what I will then discuss after that, but I will be drawing mostly on experiences learned in the battlefield, in battlefields of Mexico, where I've served on the boards and in the management of several NGOs. Let me start with the facts. In the US, the NGO sector is humongous. Humongous is a technical word that suggests very large. There are roughly 1.5 million NGOs operating in the United States. They account for roughly 5.6% of GDP. That makes them comparable in size to many of the key sectors of the American economy that immediately pop into mind when we're discussing large sectors, roughly the same size as the energy sector of the US. They employ 10% of the US workforce. So there's roughly a 1 in 10 chance that those of you who are listening now are employed by NGOs. Since I know you are not taken from a random population, it might be that you're actually more a representative of this NGO universe than that 1 in 10 number that typically applies to the United States. Roughly 1 million people, rather 11 million people are employed by NGOs in the United States. Charitable giving, which is a very critical source of income for most NGOs, is about $450 billion per year. This is about 10%, actually less than 10% of their total assets, and it is the flow that enables a lot of them to survive over time. And they come in all sizes, very small ones, really mom and pop shows, typically associated with small communities, churches and the like. But there are also some very, very large ones, especially in the educational sector, with some of the major universities being representative institutions that have that very large dimension, or health institutions that sometimes are in the tens of thousands of employees. And one of the things that is typically on the lips of people who study NGOs is that they tend to have a very turbulent life, and their lifespan on average is shorter than 10 years. I thought when I saw that 10 years, geez, that's a short lifespan. But I asked myself the question, well, how long do typical startups in the United States last? And it turns out that the typical startup lasts only 5 years in the US. So this is twice the lifespan of the average startup, but certainly a shorter lifespan than most of the corporations that survive past their first couple of years of life. So big blinding facts. This is a very big chunk of the American economy. And as a consequence, we should be concerned that things are done well when running these institutions. When we worry about what goes wrong in NGOs, we find that there's a set of issues that is recurring. And this is a list a cute list put together by Tracy Ebarb, who I don't know, who wrote a paper that's available in the internet that talks about 7 reasons why they are prone to failure. And there are a couple of them that I would really like to call your attention to. The first and the fifth, I think, are experiences that I've run across in my the personal experience in NGOs. This empty optimism, which makes people feel that if they start an NGO, since it's focused on doing good, it's going to receive the support and sympathy of a lot of people in the economy. It tends to be a very hollow form of optimism that frequently is disappointed. So it's not easy to survive the startup of an NGO. And those that do survive and go on become so confident that they frequently become overwhelmed by mission creep. They decide, geez, I was good at teaching primary school kids in need. Why don't I go on to adolescents educational requirements? And they change the segment, and in so doing, they take on challenges that they're not prepared to handle well, and frequently find themselves stumbling as a consequence. And very commonly, they forget that the most important people to keep happy with whatever they're doing are the donors that fund them. So these institutions are prone to failure. They tend to make the same mistakes over and over again. But I want to focus on 2 subjects that I really think are the lessons that I've learned in my, unfortunately, very long experience in NGOs. And I say unfortunately because it calls to mind again how old I am. I'm going to be drawing on the experiences that I had in these institutions. You're going to say, geez, none of these institutions sound familiar to me. And that's true because they're all in Mexico. But I think that they are a representative sample of the sorts of institutions that you find in the United States. The ABC is a private medical center, a hospital of about 250 beds. That's a middle-sized community hospital by American standards. It roughly has 2,000 employees and another 2,500 medical professionals associated with it. So it's a fairly large institution. It's got the best reputation of any hospital in Mexico as a service provider. And when ranked against its peers, it recurrently comes up as the #1 hospital in almost every line of service that it provides. I had the honor of being the chair of that hospital, also served on its finance committee and its strategy committee. And as a consequence of those roles, I was also part of the executive committee of this hospital. I continue to be very deeply engaged in its life, and so I know it very well. The Mexican Institute for Competitiveness is a think tank. Let me remind those of you who've not lived in public policy what think tanks do. Think tanks are private research institutions whose end products are proposals for changes in public policy. As a consequence, they typically are addressing a market failure or an area that requires further attention from either local governments or federal governments. And then they tend to, as a consequence, be very significant players in the political dimension. Not unusually, they are associated with a political party. For instance, in the United States, 2 remarkably important think tanks are the Brookings Institute, which is very closely related to the Democratic Party, and it's a very fine institution. The Republicans have 2 institutions that they're closely affiliated. One is the American Enterprise Institute, and the other is the Cato Institute, also extraordinary institutions with enormous impact on the way the public policy is shaped and in the public policy debate in the United States. Unfortunately, the environment right now for debate is so poor that we hear very little about the high quality proposals that come out of these institutions, and hear a lot of the noise that reflects the breakdown of polity in the United States. But I would argue that think tanks are really very significant and very influential institutions. Universities typically have embedded in their ranks, particularly the major research institutions, think tanks. In the case of the University of Texas, where I studied, there are both economics think tanks. There's a geo and energy policy think tank embedded in there. There was a regional think tank that has to do with the development of the University of Texas, rather than the state of Texas, and so on and so forth. I was also the founding director of the IBAFIN. IBAFIN is a graduate school, a specialist graduate school that turns out specialists in banking and finance. It's not exactly an MBA. It's a degree granting institution that turns out students with what's called an especialidad. An especialidad is similar to an MS in its duration. It's not an MBA, as MSs are in the United States. It tends to be very deeply focused in one particular area of learning, which is banking and finance. So this points you in the direction of the type of knowledge that I was involved in the development of as an economist throughout my professional life. I'm very involved in the economics of banks and the reasons they fail, by the way. Universidad de las Americas was my alma mater. I was academic vice president of that university many years ago, a member of its economics department, and then a member, actually the head of its economics department. It's a middle-sized university with about 750 employees, about 350 faculty members, 6,000 students thereabouts. So if you ran across it, you'd say, "Oh, I recognize that's an institution that's bigger than Concordia, but not as big, say, as the University of Texas, for sure." I've also been involved in 2 Anglican churches. I should say, in passing, that my wife is an Episcopal priest, so that has caused me to be, swallowed up by the vortex of the Anglican community. And I've seen them at work and help them in some of their tasks. And then last but not least, a close friend of mine put together an NGO whose purpose it is to design educational games that simulate the curriculum for primary school education in Mexico and reward students for solving problems of the sort that are found in the curriculum studies that kids face in public education in Mexico. So if they solve a math problem well, then they are awarded points that accumulates on the way to what eventually would be the equivalent of a final test. And it's turned out to be a tool that works so very, very well that the students who are using it are outperforming their peers who are going through the educational program without these digital games to nourish and complement their basic education. So all of these are good examples of different types of NGOs that are out there. You can come up with your analogs in the United States. Mexico is different from the United States, but we're not that different that we can't take lessons that can be learned from Mexican institutions and apply them to the US. And I'm going to look at a couple of them particularly. The 2 that really are on my mind are, how do you balance the search of a mission, that noble purpose that these NGOs are supposed to fulfill, with the economics and survival long-term. We called it MULA here. Margin is appropriate, a more appropriate word. And then, if you do have the resources and you're doing things right, how do you invest strategically for long-term survival and impact? Because in the final analysis, all of these institutions exist in order to fulfill a strategic purpose. And that strategic purpose typically is tied to some very specific type of assets that you want to nourish and use intelligently if you're to have success in the long term. So these are the two issues that I'll be looking at. And I'm going to do so by using two quotes to focus us on this Mullah versus mission issue. Sheikh Rashid, who was the founder of Dubai, I was taught yesterday by Christian that I should have said His Majesty before saying Sheikh Rashid, is quoted as having said, "My grandfather rode a camel, my father rode a camel, I ride a Mercedes, my son rides a Land Rover, my grandson will probably also drive a Land Rover, but my great-grandson is likely to be riding a camel again." What he was worrying about was, how do you make sure that the resources, in the case of Dubai, the non-renewable resources of that oil wealthy country are spent prudently to ensure multi-generational wealth, and as a consequence, also multi-generational income levels. And how do you avoid, as a consequence, spending yourself into a hole and not being able to ensure the long-term noble purpose of keeping a population alive and living well. And this was a wise thing for him to be worried about. I checked to see whether this quote that was attributed to him was in fact true, and it's actually his son who's being quoted talking about his father, Sheikh Rashid, having said this and having really engraved that in his mind and given him that as this great lesson to go forward. And I think that these are words that all NGOs must live by. If we're going to avoid riding a camel in the future, how do we nourish the economic entity well enough that we can ensure survival into the future? If perhaps not riding a Mercedes, at least riding in a vehicle that's appropriate for the institutional mandate to be fulfilled. There's another mantra that I would like to associate. Permanence, perseverance, and persistence in spite of obstacles, discouragement, and impossibilities. It is all of these that distinguishes the strong from the weak. This is a quote from Thomas Carlyle. And what it does is it calls to mind that permanence and perseverance are values that we should nourish in institutions that we are hoping are going to survive for the long term. And that what distinguish the successful is their permanence, and that those that are weak are typically spendthrift institutions. And I totally agree with this. The ABC hospital that I mentioned a little while ago, that community hospital that I referred to earlier, has been around for 130 years. That's a good long while. And the Mexican economy is a significantly more turbulent economy than the American economy. So when I speak of 130 years of life in a turbulent economy, I'm actually pointing to an institution that's managed to operate well in very difficult circumstances, a good deal tougher than the circumstances that attain to the American economy. And the way that it has done so is to act purposefully in the stewardship role. About 15 years ago, it institutionalized a concept which is now part of its planning process. And what they did was to self-impose an income tax. What they said was, if we were a private sector entity, what would we be paying in taxes off of our EBITDA? And let's make sure that we set that aside as our spending on vulnerable populations, but let's also make sure that we are earning enough in order to ensure the retained earnings that we required in order to fund the growth and development of the hospital in the long term. So the two magical numbers to focus on are this 7% figure that I show here. And I don't know if you can see my pointer. Can you see the pointer? Can somebody nod their heads if they see a pointer? No. Oh, yeah, thank you. That 7% figure and the 10% down here. The 10% down here says roughly what is the level of investments required in order to fund a hospital that's going to live into perpetuity. All of those earnings have got to be plowed back into equipment, human capital, and the development of capabilities that the hospital requires in order to be a very high performing entity. But the institution feels that it's not just there to serve itself and the purpose of providing health services to the population that it works with. It also feels that it should be serving a vulnerable population and that is integral to its mission. And so it sets aside roughly 7% of the top line of revenue for the investments in this vulnerable population, and 10% for investments in its own growth and development. And this 17% is then turned into the number that they target as the operating surplus that the entity has got to generate in order to be self-sustaining over time and simultaneously fulfill its noble purpose. And if you do the algebra backwards, once you've set aside those numbers, and of course we have to have an index year to work off of and go forward, this starts to tell you what the revenues have got to look like, what the operating expenses that you can tolerate as an institution would be, what earnings before interest and taxes would have to be, and in order to be able to cover depreciation and debt service expenses, less whatever donations you're able to get from the population that supports this hospital. This very purposeful economic model is one that serves this institution very well. I have seen other institutions actually run themselves into the ground by spending money that they should have focused on the purpose of growth and development in order to serve their noble purpose. And as a consequence, they really are eating up their capital and their ability to continue to serve the population that they're there to serve for in the long term. This institution has also developed a very, very robust planning process. Its financial budgeting process is very orthodox. It's equivalent in quality to that of the Walmart, and I'm sure that you guys have heard of Walmart. This is a relatively successful commercial enterprise in the United States. Its operations in Mexico are $40 billion worth of sales. So it's by far its largest non-US subsidiary. It's much larger than the Canadian operation or the operation that they have in China. A $40 billion corporation is a real corporation in anybody's mind. And the ABC is every bit as thoughtful and orthodox in the way that it plans its budget cycle as is the Walmart. They have very similar budgeting process. Management about the month of September starts to look into the next year. It comes up with a draft proposal with inputs that it carefully discusses with the finance committee. These inputs tended to be related to things such as what's the economic outlook for the country and for different segments of the population? What's the outlook for interest rates, for exchange rates, for other key indicators? And they use those inputs in order to put together a budget and to fulfill that 7% contribution for the vulnerable population that the hospital wants to serve, plus that 10% reinvestment rate that it wants to fulfill. They iterate through with the finance committee until the finance committee feels this is something that makes good, robust sense. And when that is done, typically by the end of the month of November, It's taken to the board, first to the executive committee of the board, actually. If the executive committee of the board endorses that budget, then it allows the finance committee to propose the budget to the board for approval. We're using a rolling forecasting approach at the ABC right now because the economy is so turbulent as a consequence of COVID that using any targeted long-term forecasts and saying our budget's going to be looked at only once during the year and then we'll be reviewing performance against that would be crazy. So what we're doing is, as we come across new evidence of, say, recurring COVID problems, we have done reforecasts. There are program reforecasts at the ABC once every quarter. But if along comes a surprise, and COVID certainly has provided us as a hospital with many surprises, then we go into a rolling forecast adjustment process even before that. The sorts of numbers that we watch and watch carefully are what is the occupancy of the hospital's assets, what lines of service are showing stress, how are we doing with employment levels in key functions such as nursing and technical services of the sort that are required in order to provide complementary capabilities to the hospital. And as needed, we either draft additional resources or we adjust targets in order to make sure that we are able to reach the best possible economic outcome in light of the conditions that we're actually operating under in the hospital. It's actually tougher for a hospital to go through its budgeting process in a year such as we had last year with COVID than it was for the ABC for Walmart. If you compared this process with Walmart, Walmart would have come up with a very similar process. In fact, it's almost identical. But there were fewer surprises for Walmart because Walmart basically earns 9% EBITDA on sales come what may. So the only thing that really is likely to provide surprises are drops in income levels of Mexicans, and that's typically tied to unemployment, and that's typically easier to foresee than some of the things that happened to the ABC in the light of its COVID experiences. So let me make the point very clearly. Doing finance really well at an NGO is not just important, it's a very significant survival skill. If you don't do this well, you're likely to have a dead institution before too long. As a good consequence, good stewardship really is all about budgeting judiciously, reviewing performance, introducing timely adjustments. But there are other lessons to be learned. The IMCO, the research institution that I led, or the think tank that I led, very early on, it's decided as one of its purposes that it should diversify its funding sources because we wanted to avoid being captured by our original the donors, by the people who we were close to at the founding moment, because they had economic objectives that were not always in synchrony with what was best for the country. And what we felt as an institution is that we should be serving the socially adequate purposes that Mexico required as a country, and not those purposes that were in synchrony with the people who funded us. So we told those very wonderful donors that set us up, you know, we're going to be trying to diversify away from you so that 5 years from now, we look more like a race car with lots and lots of logos on it, rather than having just one big logo on it, with the purpose of making ourselves safe over the long term, both through diversification, and through the avoidance of a political capture on the part of the people who set us up. And they blessed that purpose and sent us on our way. INOMA, which was set up by a partner of mine from McKinsey, this is the digital institution, also immediately went to work on finding deeper pockets than Toño had in order to be able to provide this digital startup with the required sources in order to keep it going. And so it went through a very purposeful funding waves, which is how I became involved in it. Not unlike what you would do if you were in a startup situation, a tech startup situation, with the different waves of funding as the institution became more mature. And recently, INOMA has been approached by a private sector investor who says, geez, I really like the nature of your products and I can see making money with them. And so they are now coming on board as private sector partners of INOMA. And this will probably provide us with that final measure of funding required in order to ensure that INOMA survives into the long term. And last but not least, and I really want to emphasize this, if you don't know who you're serving and how well you're doing it, you're not likely to have good impact. Two institutions that I've been involved with, one is Nacional Monte Piedad, which I was on the board of at one point. Nacional Monte Piedad, by the way, is a national pawn shop. That's a very weird entity, but it's been around almost 300 years. It was set up by a very wealthy miner who wanted to serve Mexico, and he said, geez, what people need is a place where they can take their treasures and get some liquidity for their treasures, as you would in a typical pawn shop. But this is run as a not-for-profit with the intention not of holding on to those things that are pawned, but rather with the intention of providing liquidity to Mexico's neediest. And we were faced at Monte de Piedad with the question of who should we be investing our resources in, and we were actually faced with a cruel choice because we didn't have infinite resources. We had to choose between supporting people in the final stages of their life, the old age people in homes for the elderly, or providing money for mothers and their children in several institutions. And what we did was measure the social rates of return of investments in one type or another of institutions. And since we wanted to maximize the impact, the social impact of our spending, it turned out that investing in mothers with young children was a much better investment than investing money in people who were in the terminal phases of their life. If you think about it coldly, it makes perfectly good sense. If you save a mother and her children, and what you're doing is providing them with the resources to become educated and then become members of a productive society, you are extending their life and also extending their earning life, and that builds up a lot of wealth and income over time. And when you bring that income back to present value, the present value of that is much higher than the present value of money spent taking care of the elderly in their terminal years of life, which is basically only charity, really not a social investment. And if you're trying to make social investments, it makes sense to spend your money where it'll have the biggest impact. And this method, which was developed at the Nacional Monte de Piedad, and which became very polemical at Monte de Piedad, by the way, and eventually led to having them ask me to please step aside because I was leading this effort. We then took on at the ABC hospital, and it's the way that we discern how we spend the 7% that we set aside for vulnerable populations in order to make sure that our spending is focused on those segments of the population which are likely to have a longer life, longer productive life than they would without our support. So it's the difference between charitable action and social investment. And since both of these institutions, in my opinion, should have been focused on social investments, measuring the social impacts was a very purposeful way of behaving and a way of ensuring good stewardship for these entities and ensuring their impact over the long term. I hope you're going to ask me questions about this later, because this is one of the big headlines that I want you to keep in mind. The other is, geez, suppose you do your stewardship well, and you are able to ensure that you have the resources to live a long life. How do you ensure that institution does excellent work? And what are your strategic investments? And let me point you again to the institutions that I have served on the board of or in management of, and make the argument that the vast majority of NGOs are service institutions. And service institutions, by and large, live and die by the quality of their strategic human capital assets. They don't live by the quality of their physical installations, though physical installations can make a difference, as in the case of hospitals, for instance. But rather, doctors and nurses are much more valuable assets for the performance of and excellence of a hospital than X-ray machines or MRIs or fancy surgical equipment. And I'm not discounting the use of these others, but having those without having excellent human capital means that you have invested in the cart and not in the horses. And you need both in order to make it really work. In the case of a think tank, you need good senior researchers of the sort that can lead the work of others. In good institutions of higher learning, you need proven faculty. And yesterday, I thought I was going to alarm Kristen by saying, geez, I think that things such as the systems that are in vogue in most universities to give people tenure probably makes sense, because what they are is tests of intellectual quality, and it's part of building a meritocracy. And consequently, when I speak of faculty, proven faculty, as a strategic asset of graduate schools such as the Bafin or the University of the Americas, I'm talking about those senior faculty members or researchers who are competent to do the sort of work that puts an institution on the map and that attract and retain the support of donors and of other institutions' respect and admiration. In the case of churches, you would look to priests as probably the Anglican, so I use the word priest, but it could be ministers, as a key asset. But there's generally a small set of key parishioners that really make a difference as well, and you want to hold on to those people. And in the case of Inoma, the strategic asset were game designers, people who were funky in their mind, came up with very creative ways of testing the competencies, capabilities of children as they learned. And all of these strategic assets are really what you want to invest in this type of service institution. In order to attract and retain this type of talent, you have to do several things very, very well. And if you're going to be running an NGO that makes a difference and that has impact, you want to make sure that you reward talent generously. Economic rewards are part of it, but providing them with leadership opportunities and with visibility is sometimes as important as providing them with economic rewards. This is frequently missed by people who run institutions. They don't provide enough leadership opportunities to the staff behind them. Those staff leave. Let me give you an example. I was the founding director of UAFIN, and I made the mistake of thinking that that really what mattered was that I was there, and that you know, with somebody as talented as me at the top, everything would be fine. And after a while, I found out that there were a lot of squeaky wheels making squeaky noises behind me, and that what was lacking were the leadership and visibility rewards required in order to keep people feeling happy and recognized. And recognition turned out to be a more important way of rewarding this talent, and as a consequence, stimulating this talent, than providing them with economic rewards. This is not to say that you shouldn't provide them with economic rewards, but it is to say a lot of people choose to be in NGOs because of the nature of the challenge, not because of the economic reward in the challenge. And if you don't provide them with opportunities to show their commitment and their excellence, they're going to be unhappy. You should also invest in the development of individuals with high potential. And in order to be able to invest in those high potential individuals, you have to be willing to prune chronic underperformers. And I think you have to be remorseless in pruning chronic underperformers. You can't afford to carry underperformers, even if they are really committed to the noble mission of the institution, because an underperformer isn't earning his way and isn't helping the institution to grow and develop. And I think you have to get rid of employees that poison the institutional culture rapidly. I had put the word jerk in here, and then I was recommended that I use a different word instead of jerk. And so we ended up employees that poison institutional culture. But getting rid of jerks is really, I think, very important. Most of these institutions have talent, when they have real talent, that can find positions elsewhere. Typically, you can't hold on to them through economics. It's providing them with a culture where they feel good and happy and recognized is more important. And if you let somebody poison that environment, you're going to lose some of those high performers as a consequence of the poisonous culture or the toxic culture that's developed. And last but not least, I think you have to invest in the development of an ethical culture that rewards correct behaviors. And let me point you to a case that I was very involved in because it happened while I was chair of the hospital. Our highest billing doctor at the hospital was discovered to be billing very high amounts, amongst other reasons because he was doing what was called ghosting. Ghosting is pretending to be doing a surgery while somebody else is actually doing the surgery that you are then later going to sign for. And so he would actually sign up to 2 or 3 different simultaneous operations at the same time, but actually only go into one of the operating rooms and pretend that he was in the other 2, where people that worked for him, staff members, were doing the work there. This was highly unethical. This was not with the support and certainly without the knowledge of the patients that were exposed to the work of the junior staff. These junior staff were frequently talented medical practitioners themselves, so they weren't really being exposed to terrible dangers, but there was a lie implicit in this behavior. The lie was that the person who was doing the cutting and suturing and the intervention was this very highly recognized guru who did oncological surgery and was recognized as amongst the best in the country, when in fact what he was doing was sending in one of his practitioners and and then pretending that he'd been in the operating room when he was in the post-surgical circumstance visiting his patients. We fired that person. And firing this extraordinarily high performer was important in order to send a message to the entire institution that this was not tolerable. We probably would not have fired him if he had gotten consent from the patients to have his staff members do these interventions. All that would have required is for him to honestly say, you know, Fulanito, this person that works on my team, is equally qualified to do this intervention. He and I have talked about how it will be done, or she and I have talked about how it will be done. I trust that she's going to do it fine. And I think most of those patients would have said, that's fine, let's go with that. And there would have been no lie there. It's the fact that he pretended that he was doing the surgery that we found to be intolerable. This was against the culture that we were trying to build. And so getting rid of our high performer cost us. It certainly created embarrassments, and we had to go back and talk to the people he had pretended to have provided surgery to, and tell them, you know, we have found out ex post facto that this was going on. We are glad that nothing's happened to you as a consequence of that, but we want you to know that this doctor is no longer part of our staff because we don't agree with the behavior that we saw. Who really responded best to that were other members of the medical staff of the hospital, who felt that our behavior in throwing out their high-performing colleague was a good, strong demonstration of the ethical culture that we were trying to build, and who celebrated that we had the guts and the conviction to act out our values in the interest of our patients' health. And
Dr. Newell Garcia, we're almost to the bottom of the hour. I was wondering if we could switch gears. We've got a few questions.
I'm going to shut up now because that's the slide that follows. All right. I tend to like my own voice, guys. Go ahead, ask questions.
So we had a question regarding your last slide about pruning underperforming employees. And this question comes from Phil, who says, I currently run my parents' commercial cleaning company, and we commonly run into issues with our employees on underperformance. Although I believe we should prune them, due to some of them being with the company for so long, my father sees them as loyal. He chooses to use the 80-20 rule. What's your take on this?
You're setting an example that other colleagues who see the underperformers be rewarded just simply because they've been around for a long time will take as the accepted culture. So what you're doing is breeding the next wave of underperformance. It's your company to run, and if you want to use your resources, your institutional resources that way, I can't fault you for that. But I do think what you're doing is undermining the long-term well-being of the company by doing so.
Okay, thanks. Another question, you mentioned briefly the COVID impact to the hospital. What other pandemic impacts do you see for NGOs?
Educational institutions have really been rocked by the pandemic. What has happened is that, and let me point to the case of the Universidad de las Americas. We have relatively significant dormitories and a very nice campus. It's very clear that campus and those dormitories don't have a use during the pandemic, and however, maintaining them and keeping them has significant cost associated with it. What we discovered was that our break-even point was very high because of those assets. And when the pandemic kept everybody at home, we didn't have the revenues associated with either dorms or the use of those facilities. In fact, many parents chose to withdraw their kids from the university during the pandemic, thinking that the educational value was not there as a consequence. And so revenues fell as a consequence of loss of students and of loss of the revenues associated with life of the institution from the undergraduate body that used those dorms. Oh, it really blasted our economics, and I think that that's a very typical experience of many institutions that provide that type of undergraduate facility in the United States. So that's a very normal, I think, experience. We've also moved into technology, and while technology has worked quite well, and I think we're seeing an example of that right now, I don't think it's equivalent in its quality and in impact to face-to-face interaction. And as a consequence, there is mounting evidence that the quality of education has actually dropped off as a consequence of the pandemic, and that there is actual value in the face-to-face interaction between students and each other, and students and faculty members with each other as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for your presentation and for answering our questions. We're also grateful for everybody who participated today and for all that you do. And I wanted to also give a shout out to our partnerships, marketing, and IT teams who helped behind the scenes with this webinar. So I wanted to end with wishing everybody good health and peace for all of us. And we continue our commitment to help you hone your skills that you need in a world that needs us all. So again, a big welcome and thank you to Dr. Roverto as well. Yes.
Can I make an offer? If you can use the chat tool in order to send in questions, if you have them, I'd be glad to respond with them. Okay.
Okay, great. Yes, if there are further questions, please put those in the chat and we'll make sure we get those answers to you. And again, let us know how you liked our presentation, your feedback, and your ideas and inspiration. So thank you again, and everybody have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you so much.